October 17th, we are less than 3 weeks away from a presidential election that millions of Americans on both sides of the aisle consider to be one of the most important and consequential elections in the history of the United States. Good evening, I'm Jim Cooper, chair of SigTalks and member of the New York City Alumni Chapter. And tonight's SigTalk is about the upcoming election. We're calling it Decision 2024. If you've been following SigTalks for the past few years, you may recall our SigTalk in October 2022, preceding the midterm elections. Our guests were Mack McLarty and Bill McGinley. They provided expert analysis and opinions on the key House of Representative and senatorial races of 2 years ago. Certainly one of the most riveting SigTalks we have ever enjoyed. Well, they're back. Mack and Bill have graciously agreed to join us tonight for the SigTalk Decision 2024, focusing, of course, on the presidential election, as well as the upcoming House and Senate races. So, to refresh your memories, here is some brief information on their backgrounds. Thomas Mack McLarty has had a distinguished career in business leadership roles, government, and public service. Most notably, he served as President Bill Clinton's chief of staff. In that role, Mack had significant impact on enactment of the Deficit Reduction Package, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the Family Medical Leave Law. Mack also served as advisors to Presidents Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush on several domestic and international issues. Mack graduated summa cum laude from the University of Arkansas, where he was initiated as a Sigma Chi. Bill McGinley's legal career has intersected with government and politics at several junctures. Following law school, he served as deputy counsel to the Republican National Committee and was counsel to the Standing Committee on Rules for the RNC. He also served as counsel to the National Republican Senatorial Committee, in addition to time spent in private legal practice. Bill developed such a strong reputation in those capacities that the Trump administration offered him the position of White House Cabinet Secretary. As such, he was the direct link between all cabinet members and President Trump. He served 2.5 years in that role from 2017 to 2019. Bill is a graduate of the University of California, Los Angeles, where he was initiated as a Sigma Chi. He is a student of history, as that was his major at UCLA. Bill also received a master's in history from the University of California, Long Beach. His Juris Doctorate in law was earned at the George Washington University School of Law, located in the District of Columbia. At the back end of tonight's talk, Mack and Bill will tell us a bit more about the work they did with the presidents in those assignments. Another key individual on our talk tonight is moderator David Ashenoff. David has held several positions as a Sigma Chi alum. Just a few that I will mention. He's currently president of the Washington Alumni Chapter, which is the partner with New York for production of SigTalks. Also, he was formerly Grand Praetor of the Eastern Virginia Province. He's currently also the International Fraternities Chair for its Government Affairs Committee. David's had a keen interest in government and politics from a young age, and today, in his professional career, occupies the position of Senior Director of Political Affairs for the Associated General Contractors of America, getting the opportunity to work closely with several members of the U.S. Congress. David's a graduate of the College of William and Mary, where he was initiated as a Sigma Chi. Now, something of which I can assure you. Stay with us for the next hour of this SigTalk, and you will hear objective and incisive information and viewpoints about the upcoming elections that, in my opinion, exceed in value anything you would learn from watching CNN or Fox News. So, Mack and Bill, welcome back to SigTalks. David, please get tonight's talk started.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Jim. It's great to be back with you tonight on SigTalks. And honestly, I can't think of a better Sigma Chi duo to have on the program than Mack and Bill. So, gentlemen, thank you. A real big appreciation from both alumni chapters for joining us again for this election preview. And if you're ready, let's get to it. So the economy is top of mind for voters, and it's been the number one issue throughout several months of polling. Inflation and prime interest rates have come down. However, what do you expect will really be the impact of the higher prices being baked into really almost everything consumers purchase? And Mack, let's have you kick things off first.
Well, David, first of all, it's good to be with you. Thank you for facilitating us in a very skilled manner, as always. Bill, great to be back with you as we reprise. We have a sequel here of our 2022 events. I'm looking forward to it. You're great to engage with, and thank you for the manner and the keen insight that you provide. Jim, you set the bar pretty high here with riveting and so forth, and Bill and I will do our best to meet it. I think, David, to respond to your question, James Carville might have been onto something in 1992 that was the economy stupid. That seems to have continued. It's not surprising. It has been throughout modern politics in terms of the electorate and certainly presidential elections. I think this year is a little bit different in the sense that the economy in some ways has been relatively strong in terms of unemployment staying low and Chairman Powell trying to guide us toward a soft landing. Having said that, David, I think you make the right point, is people still feel that prices are too high. The high inflation that really came to pass following COVID and the supply chain and the stimulation by the Fed and the Congress, which led to inflationary pressures that shot up inflation, and that's what the Fed's been working on. That is still very much on the voter's mind. And if you look at comparing the two candidates, former President Trump still benefits from what is perceived to be, and in some ways was, better days pre-COVID. On the other hand, I think Vice President Harris has a strong case to make on the economy. That's what we'll see in this sprint to the finish line.
Yeah, and first of all, Mack, always appreciate your insights and the manner in which you do it. It's really an honor to be with you. And David and Jim, really appreciate you guys organizing this. It's always great to talk to our brothers and our guests on this important topic. To kind of piggyback off of what Mack said, I think I'd probably take a different tact and how I'd kind of describe it. I really think if you look at the working class families, the middle class families, and what they've had to go through exiting the pandemic and really trying to struggle with inflation, really eating up the family budget. I do think, I agree, the economy is going to be one of the top issues. And I think working class families are, working 2-3 jobs just to make ends meet, keep the kids in after school programs, try and get them a better education if they can afford it, but just to make ends meet. And making all the sacrifices that they have to do right now. I think the American people really are, looking at the economy and asking a basic question: is this the best we can do? Is there a way for the economy to improve? Is there a way for my life to get better, for me to be able to provide a better income for our families so that maybe we have a little bit of discretionary income? And I think Mack made a good point. I think people look at the pre-COVID Trump administration, where inflation was around 1% and pretty low. Real wages were rising. There was a lot of job opportunity there. And really, blue collar workers and working class families did actually see some a boost in their income as compared to their expenses. And so I think when people do go to the ballot box today, I think they are going to ask them that fundamental question. Do I feel like this is the best that the United States can do, or can we do better? Is there a way for us to have positive change in the economy so that my family has greater opportunities and my kids especially could potentially have a better future than I have right now?
So thanks, Mack and Bill, on that. And you definitely make some good points on how you think the economy is really going to affect that mindset as voters head into that booth to make their selections. Are there other economic factors besides what we see in inflation, whether it's something like gas prices or energy prices, especially with, the Northeast as we head into some of the colder months? Is there any others that you think are going to have a significant influence on voters' choices?
Yeah, I think you hit the key point. I mean, certainly during the time that I had the privilege to work in the White House with President Clinton and Vice President Gore, energy prices, David, as Bill knows so well, are just crucial to the economy and how people feel that they are doing in their daily lives, because they certainly fill up at the pump, and gas prices are a good measure of that people see in their everyday activities. So far, gas prices have stayed lower than many thought they would, particularly with the Ukraine-Russia war and now the conflict in the Middle East. So I think right now they are reasonably stable, but they did have a period there where they were a bit higher, going back to Bill's point. Again, it kind of depends where you pick that point in time, because real wages have exceeded inflation for, I think, the past 9 months. Same with energy prices, but there's no question that that's going to be a driving factor in this campaign as we move toward the election. There will be other factors, including immigration, which is a hot button issue for sure. Again, that favors former President Trump, although Vice President Harris has made a really strong effort to address that in her recent interviews. But on the other side, you've got Roe v. Wade, and Bill, you and I talked about the 2022 election. That clearly was a motivating force on turnout in the midterms. Climate change will also be an animating issue for the Democratic side. So those are kind of your balances there. But let's not forget two other points I would quickly make, and then turn it over to pass the baton to Bill. One is foreign affairs right now is front and center with the conflicts in the Middle East, Ukraine-Russian war, the rise of China. That's got to be paramount in voters' minds, how they choose the next president. I know we're going to talk a little bit about the vice president as well. And so I think all of these factors will come into play. And right now, the American people are pretty unsettled. The right track, wrong track is not where we would like it to be. It's too negative. And people are just unsettled about this race at the moment.
Yeah, and I think on the economic front, domestically, just to add one thing to what Max said, I think interest rates are also a significant concern for working families, and I really think it's also for the small businesses. Having the ability to get access to capital so that you can expand your business, meet your payroll, and everything else that a small business goes through, I think it's a very significant issue. And as we saw, I think it was about 18 months ago, where interest rates really started spiking, and some of the regional banks who had invested their money in treasuries, all of a sudden they had some significant losses that really caused some problems. Silicon Valley Bank being the prime example, but there were others around the country as well. And so I think the health of the banking system, the health of the family budget, I think is really crucial. But I really think small business owners who are trying to not only establish a business, but to keep it afloat and to expand it if they're fortunate enough. I think the access to capital and what the rising interest rates mean for them, I think is going to be really, really critical. Plus the housing market. Mac touched a bit on foreign affairs, and I think in the global world that we live in right now, and I know that a lot of people try to portray the race as globalist versus populist. I think watching what's happening over in the Middle East, as Max said, Chinese aggression toward Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, but let's not forget about North Korea. And frankly, the Iranians are getting very adventurous in the Middle East, even though Israel seems to be handing them a number of setbacks that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. And, military families are bearing the brunt of this as well. I mean, if you're an enlisted person in the armed services, you're having trouble making ends meet. And I think that, that's a real issue that's going to have to be addressed in the future. And not only is that part of our national security and foreign affairs, but I think it's a big domestic issue as well, making sure that the men and women who are brave enough and courageous enough and patriotic enough to serve this country in uniform, put their lives at risk. I think, we need to be thinking about them and what the inflationary factors and some of the other things we've been talking about are having an impact on their families as well.
You guys make good points there, and you got a little bit ahead of where we were going to head to this next question. So you kind of gave a little preview for folks on, but Hef, if you can, go ahead and throw up chart 1. Here we can see the issues according to Gallup that are top of mind for voters right now. And if it's a little sort of hard to read for those of you at home, just know that if you're looking at that left chart, the economy is number 1, followed by democracy, terrorism and national security, Supreme Court appointments, immigration, education, healthcare, gun policy, abortion, taxes, and crime, and the list continues. And then on the right side, we can see who voters feel can do a better job handling those issues. On those that I think are a little bit more of top of mind for voters right now, it looks to be that Trump has that edge on the economy, on immigration, and on foreign affairs. And with Vice President Harris getting the edge on healthcare, abortion, and climate change. Bill, since Mac started out the last question, which of these or even 2 issues or so in the chart that we see are really going to have the greatest impact on the voting choices for those that are still undecided or those that may follow that sort of independent streak in who they select come November 5th?
Look, I think the economy is going to be the top issue for the reasons we just discussed in the last segment. But I also think the border, the transnational criminal organizations, the cartels really seem to have taken control of the border. We see fentanyl deaths every day in America. It's really an epidemic right now, and we need to get a handle on that. But also just your average crime. I mean, unfortunately, I think crime is going to be one of the issues that a lot of people are thinking about. If you're a working class family, if you're a middle class family with kids in public schools, I think you come home every night and you begin to ask the question, are my kids learning the skill sets they need to compete to get jobs in the United States? But we as a country need to start asking the question, are we failing these kids to the point where it's going to become a national security issue? Because education, if you look at the standards, keeps falling and falling and falling. Something has really gone wrong in education, and we need to take a look at it. We need to start building up STEM education so that we can get the engineers and the mathematicians and everybody else we need for tomorrow. We need to start to address that. But I really think also, that the trade policy is going to come to the forefront again. I mean, the Biden administration did not touch the tariffs. And in fact, they've agreed with President Trump, and all of the signals that they've sent is that if Vice President Harris was still going to be there, she would probably still continue them. I mean, President Trump really led by leadership in trying to bring American jobs back home that had been exported overseas. So I think the economy, the jobs, I think education, I think crime, the border is something that we see every day. And I think there's a lot of families out there that have been suffering under the weight of all these issues. And I think they really are ready for some positive change. And it's why, President Trump is really gaining amongst African-American males, amongst Hispanics. I think, if you start to look at, burrow down into some of the numbers that we see in these polls, I think there's really been a sea change in that a lot of people who traditionally voted Democratic are taking a fresh look at the Republican Party. And I think it's something to watch and see if it actually follows through on November 5th.
Matt?
Well, I think we've talked about the issues already. David, we may have gotten a bit ahead, as you noted. But I think Bill and I have tried to, I think we agree on what the top 5 issues or 6 or 7 issues are. And we've discussed kind of the 2 ways the candidates may approach this. Let me take a step back. I think to be sure we set a perspective here properly, this is a very close race. It reflects a divided country. We have kind of lost comparisons of a jump ball, too close to call, a real horse race, all of these things. We've kind of lost how to describe it because the polls reflect, to the extent we believe the polls are accurate, a very, very tight race in these 7 swing states and the Electoral College going either way. So right now, I do not believe that former President Trump or Vice President Harris have closed the deal. It's still an open race. And these issues we've talked about are going to be part of that. But I also think it's been remarkably a status environment here, even with the sweeping sweeping events that we've had. Just think about it for a moment. We had a sitting president in President Biden decide not to seek re-election after the debate. We then had Vice President Harris later come in after the assassination attempt. That's a sweeping change. And yet the 50-50, the very tight race, has stayed very much locked. I think we probably have less than 10% undecided voters at the moment.
Yeah, and we're going to see in this next chart that we're going to throw up how really close this election is in the battlegrounds. And I think once we get through this election and can actually dig into some of the exit polls and analysis that comes with that to actually see which issues really were drivers to get folks out to the polls. You know, we have the issues that people say that, you know, here's what I think is the top issue for me going into this election. But is it really something that's going to motivate them to go vote? And I know that in, you know, the last election, abortion was very big, getting folks to actually go out to the polls and vote. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if issues like immigration, we know the economy does that, but are there going to be other ones like that education, like Bill, you mentioned, are those really going to be drivers to get folks to the polls? And I'm going to be really interested in that analysis once it comes out after the fact. But Hef, if you can throw up chart 6, and we'll be able to see that battleground polling that Mac, you were kind of alluding to really show how close of a race this is. And here we've got the battleground states of Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. We can see what the Real Clear Politics average is of the latest national polls in a two-person race between the vice president and the former president, as well as the multi-way race that includes the independent candidates and third parties. So, Mac, which of these do you believe to be like really the most crucial to the election outcome? And do you think that your candidate will prevail in that state?
Well, predicting elections, particularly close ones, sometimes it's a fool's errand, as we have.
Well, that's why we got you and Bill on tonight.
And I'll get to, you know, I think, Bill, we'll probably have to fulfill our duty here in spirit of the being members of Sigma Chi to make some predictions here. 2022. I think that the real answer, David, is right now. It is too close to call. Governor Haley Barbour, who was chairman of the Republican National Committee, two-term governor of Mississippi, likes to say anybody who tells you they know how this race is going to turn out, either one, doesn't know what they're talking about, or two, they're just lying to you. And he's probably right, only how he can say it that way. It's interesting because, David, what you could have is one, a very, very close race, which it certainly will be at the state level in these 7 swing states. But you could have a relatively large swing in the Electoral College with a very few number of votes. That can happen. Elections have a way, as Bill well knows, and we all do, of kind of beginning to solidify, beginning to break a little at some point in time in the race. In my judgment, that has not happened yet. I think from Vice President Harris's standpoint, the blue wall, as it's called in the Midwest, is crucial to her reelection. She's got some other pathways, but that's crucial. And instead of all roads leading to Ohio, as Bill, you recall, used to be the case 20 years ago, even less, it's now all roads are clearly leading to Pennsylvania, where both candidates are spending a lot of time in that state, and both vice presidential candidates were chosen with that in mind as well. So it's just so close right now. I do think, David, to pick up on your point, in my judgment, this will have a large turnout. This election will have a very large turnout. And so motivating not just the base, but the overall turnout and what issues do that, whether and kind of the dynamics of it, is going to have clearly a dramatic impact on the election. So I think that's where we are.
And then, Bill, what do you think?
Mac and I, unfortunately, are going to exercise some bipartisanship here. I agree with him. It's a very close election. But I do think that there's a couple of things that we can look at over the past year. And I think Mac hit on some of the kind of guideposts of what's gotten us to where we are in 2024. everything from the first assassination attempt on President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, and his reaction, and frankly, the courage that he showed under fire, I think really kind of inspired people who support his candidacy, including myself. I think he then rolled into a very good convention. I think that right after the convention, with President Biden deciding to get out of the race, and then the Democratic Party coalescing around Vice President Harris, and her enjoying, frankly, a honeymoon period over the summer, rolling into her convention. I think that sugar high has ended. I think the honeymoon period is over, and now we're settling back into what everybody expected this race to be, which is really fighting voter by voter. It's going to be a base turnout election, plus the campaigns who can persuade the medium and low propensity voters to actually motivate and get out and vote. Some of the stuff that people will be looking at to try and read the tea leaves will not only be the polling data, which I think Mac and I were burned in 2022. I know that a lot of Republicans thought that it was going to be a better night than it was. You look at 2020 when, former Vice President Biden was supposed to win some of these states by 12 points. And instead only won a few of them by 10,000 votes. We really came within about 40,000 votes of having a completely different electoral college result in 2020. I think, this is going to be a very, very close election. But as Max said, there are times where you could see late in the cycle, usually in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, sometimes a lot of these states begin to fall in the same direction. Who knows whether that's going to happen this time or not. I know the campaigns are out there fighting and trying to go after every single voter that they can get. And I think that the volunteer armies for each campaign are going to be critically important because I think without that, the Democrats have a huge monetary advantage. Kamala Harris has raised $1 billion. She's supported by a dark money network that probably has close to $2 billion that does get out the vote messaging and everything else. Republicans have their outside groups, but they don't even come close to what the Democrats have. And so it's going to be interesting to see. I think one of the big stories coming out of 24, if President Trump's able to prevail, is once again, they're going to write about how important is the money advantage. Because he was outraised by Hillary Clinton in 2016, but won. He was outraised by former Vice President Biden. Former Vice President Biden ended up prevailing, and we'll see what happens in this election. I mean, as Mac knows, we've seen time and time again, and typically it's with wealthy, self-funding candidates, just don't get the traction. And it's the candidate that gets out there, works the donors, works the voters, and actually gets out and addresses the issues that people care about are the ones that prevail. So I think it's going to be an interesting storyline after 24.
And so, David, I might just want to try to interject one question to our guests. And this one might be a little controversial, guys, but I'll just toss it out there and see how you handle it.
We're all brothers.
In the United States, we have never elected a woman as president. Is that a factor?
Oh, I think
you want to go first, Mike?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a factor, Jim, that the candidates, their personalities, how people see a candidate's place in history, which is the timing. We saw that so vividly in the John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon race following Dwight Eisenhower, different than what the point you're making. But I think clearly, I think Kamala Harris has, I think, handled that issue pretty skillfully in the sense that she has not made an emphasis about her being the first woman president if she's elected. That could have worked for or against Secretary Clinton, depending on how you saw that perspective. But I do think that her being vice president and the way she has stepped up and stepped in, has not closed the deal yet, people can envision a woman as president. And we've seen that in other countries, from Germany to most recently in Mexico. So I think that if anything is a modest positive in this election. There's a lot of talk about men voters and kind of a split of gender here. And I think there's some truth to that. But that's always been the case in our election. I still remember a line from a hit movie where the wife one of the characters says, "Don't tell your father, but I'm going to vote Democratic this year," to her daughter. So that's always, and that's been, that was probably 50 years ago in that scene, so to speak. So that's always been a factor, but I don't think that's going to be a particularly negative factor with Vice President Harris. If anything, I think it's a modest plus.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people try to make that an issue, and I'm not saying that of you, Jim. But I really do believe that when you get outside the Beltway, when you actually get out to real America, to me, the most important factor is looking at right track, wrong track. And right now, the wrong track's about 71%. It's high 60s at least. And I think some of those issues, and I have faith in the American people. I think the American people generally, not always, make the right choice in my mind. But I will say that the issues are so consequential in this election. Everybody says this election's the most important one in American history. I do think this election is right up there, given what we're seeing overseas, given what we're facing at home, given what the families are struggling with. And I think that the gender of the candidate, I think, is not going to be at top of mind in this election cycle. I think it's going to be, are you talking about the policies? Do you have a road forward to make their lives better through gainful employment, providing for their families, small business owners being able to do what they want to do? Are we going to have a strong military that's going to keep us safe? And I just think, I just think those are the issues that are going to dominate the decision matrix for the voters, and not whether somebody is a male or a female.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Good substance and skillfully handled.
Well, Jim, just to put a PS, I think Bill really crystallized and said what some of the points I was trying to make, but I think we very much see it the same way. This is a consequential election, and I think people are looking for leadership and who's going to lift their lives and make it better in their own minds.
That's right.
All right, well, let's go back to those battleground states for the minute. And really, I want to pick out North Carolina. North Carolina has voted Republican for quite a few presidential cycles. Former President Obama picked it up in 2008. But there's been a bit of political drama in the state with the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Mark Robinson. And I think that's given Democrats some optimism about their prospects for a possible upset there in the presidential race. Hef, if you can, bring up chart 11. Here we can see where Real Clear has the race right now in the state. You've got the vice president squeaking out a slight lead of 0.2% over the former president. But then we can also see in some of the polling right below that the race has gone back and forth between the former president and the vice president and tied in one of those latest polls. What are you guys hearing? What are your thoughts coming out of the Tar Heel state? And Bill, let's start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think the people in Western North Carolina in the mountainous regions who were hit by Hurricane Helene, I think have really been impacted. I applaud the state legislature there, and I know that the campaign has been working tirelessly to make sure that the affected individuals and voters and families are taken care of and able to cast their ballots. And, there's been some criticism of FEMA and the Biden-Harris response. And I think, Democrats push back and say that, it's not true. But, the devastation is real in Western North Carolina. And, those things, these types of events can really galvanize people to get out. It doesn't mean that the top of mind issue that they're living with right now is how I'm going to cast my ballot. I think it's going to be take care of my family, make sure that everybody's safe, try and restore my property, or get my family established again. But I do think it galvanizes voters, and I think Western North Carolina, I'd keep an eye on it on voter turnout. North Carolina has been a close state in prior elections. Yes, at the presidential level, Republicans for the past 3 cycles have carried it. You've got 2 Republican senators there. I think, the Republican infrastructure is strong. The RNC chairman is from North Carolina and knows the state. I think it's a state that Republicans are going to carry. I think it's going to be close, but I do think that the Republicans will be able to do it. And I understand why the Democrats are trying to make it into a battleground. But I don't see it. I don't see that a Democratic victory materializing. But I do think it's going to be. I do think President Trump will win it, whether it's a small margin or larger. But I do think he'll carry the day there.
Bill, I think it's too close to call right now. Your points are well made as usual. I think the point about the hurricane is exactly the right place to start in North Carolina. We would have started very differently. We might have had some of the same assessments, but started very differently had we not had that Mother Nature intervention with the devastation and tragedy that's occurred there. And look, these events like this count. I was very proud of the way FEMA handled these types of matters during the Clinton administration. We got generally good marks for that. We saw later Hurricane Katrina, President Bush 43 will quickly say we didn't respond quite the way we should have there. So these things do count. As far as North Carolina, you've got a sitting governor that's a Democrat and a very strong Democratic gubernatorial candidate in North Carolina. I think it's just too close to call right now, David. That's not a sidestep. I think that's stating the basis of the race.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know when we both had you all on our program back in 2022, Republicans were expecting that sort of widespread victory, and some were really predicting that red tsunami to happen, especially in the House. We saw that didn't happen, but Republicans did win, enough seats to take control of that chamber. To what do you attribute the 22 midterm results to? And even more important now, will those same factors be relevant in the 2024 House elections? And I'll ask you why and why not. And let's start with you, Mack, on this one.
It's a different race in 2024. It's a presidential race, not a midterm. I would start there. I think there was a pretty animated voting turnout on the Democratic side that changed that race for a lot of different reasons, primarily Roe v. Wade, but other reasons. But it was a midterm election. This is going to be a big turnout, in my opinion, on both sides. So I think it's different, again, different time and place. I think these are presidential issues that will impact in a different way, resonate in a different way in 2024. But that will affect some House races for sure. And we'll get, I think, to the Senate and House, Bill, and I'll rely on you, Bill, more for the House than the Senate. I think I'm pretty attuned on the Senate. But I think this is a little unusual, Bill, in the sense that the coattails don't seem to be quite the same way we've seen them in past elections here. We've got various candidates doing better as Democrats and some Republicans that are where that doesn't reflect the current presidential standing in polling. So I think, David, it's a very different landscape is the bottom line.
Yeah, and I think, 2022 was a very unique year. You had the Dobbs decision handed down the summer of 22 that really galvanized the Democratic base and helped drive the turnout. I think the Democrats, with a lot of their get out the vote infrastructure, both in the party structure, but also kind of in their outside group network, I think was really in a position to capitalize on the energy that the Dobbs decision provided to them. And I think that really kind of changed the course of the election. I think Republicans back in 22 probably didn't put the emphasis they should have on get out the vote. I think, there was a time when Republicans really dominated that area. You look at the 2004 reelect for President Bush and the way that they were able to pull Republican voters out of the deepest blue of precincts to get them to vote. So it aggregate to victories both at the House, Senate, and the presidential level. And it just wasn't there in 22. There were some anomalies such as the snowstorm up in Reno, if I remember correctly, for the Nevada Laxalt Senate race that I think really depressed turnout on election day. He lost by a couple thousand votes. That could have been the difference there. That's not an excuse. The Republican Party, and it's been an emphasis at the Trump campaign, it's been an emphasis at the RNC and everything else to really rebuild and to galvanize the get out the vote operation and to emphasize early voting for the very reasons that, we've been talking about. You could have a natural disaster. You could, God forbid, have something else. But bank your vote, get it in early, and then so the parties can move on and focus on the low propensity voters and have them get them to turn out. So I think 22 was a bit of anomaly. I do think with kind of, I'll call it the GOTV awakening of the Republican Party and the Trump campaign, who I think have done a really good job on this. I think that some of these states that may not be competitive are going to be competitive. And when you look at Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, states that really kind of have uniform blue leadership at the statewide level, for President Trump to be competitive is kind of a testament to that. Now, the fact that Vice President Harris continues to compete, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, I think is just, this is going to be a vote by vote battle for both campaigns. And it's really going to, I hate to say it, but the most committed could win this. People who's got the most energized base is going to win this. Who can turn out the base and motivate the low propensity voters prevail. And, some of the stuff, the assassination attempt on President Trump, and I look at a lot of the stuff, this is not the 20 campaign for President Trump. And that's why I think this is competitive and he's got a great shot and hopefully he'll win.
I think Bill made an excellent point on the committed, who's the most committed here. I think there will be some additional voters, Bill, perhaps substantially. I think younger people are somewhat motivated by Vice President Harris. I don't think they would have been by President Biden. I think that's going to be an additional positive for her. You've already noted some potential pickups or positive for former President Trump. I think you're right. So all of that leads right back to what we've been talking about here for the past 40 minutes.
So sticking with the 22 midterms for a minute, two of the places that really helped Republicans get that slim majority in the House came from seats that are in, New York and California. And of note, we've got a fellow Sigma Chi brother, Josh Raleigh, actually a fellow grad from William & Mary who I graduated with in 2003, making his second attempt to flip New York 19, which happens to be one of those seats. Bill, what do you anticipate is going to happen with these seats in this election?
I think California and New York really are an interesting story for the House of Representatives because the four pickups, if I remember correctly, from 22 in New York really kind of gave the Republicans the majority. And it's important to kind of understand the history there. If you remember, there was a redistricting, the gerrymandered map that was adopted was so over the top that even a New York state judge threw it out. And asked a special master to redraw it. And frankly, it made a lot of the seats in New York that otherwise probably would have been Democratic strongholds competitive. And so they were able to pick up the seats there. California, continues to be a struggle for Republicans. But when you look at some of the seats that they've been able to hold on, like David Valadao, in the middle of the state, somebody who lives in, I think it's like a D plus something, but he continues to be able to win because he's a really good match for the district. Katie Porter has now left, I think it's California 47, because she ran for Senate and didn't prevail in the primary. And there's a strong Republican candidate there. That could be a pickup. There's opportunities for Republicans, but I think, Democrats are probably looking at some of the states that Republicans were able to take that were in the Biden plus name the number seats. And I think they're really going to try on that, especially in a presidential year. They're going to try and ride the presidential turnout machine to try and overtake some of those. The important antidote to that is in 2020, given the number of votes that were recorded for Joe Biden, as compared to President Trump, the fact that Republicans picked up 15 congressional seats, I thought was really remarkable. And the question is, are we going to see something like that again? Not necessarily Republican, but, are we going to see something that kind of disconnects from the presidential level results? Because some of these, voters really are viewing these elections as a contest between two candidates as opposed to a national wave. Mm-hmm. And I think, all politics seems to be getting more local again. And people are paying attention to the candidates, especially with, how prominent social media and everything else is becoming. The data dump and the information overload on the candidates in the congressional district, I think, is having a material impact. So would love to hear Mack's thought on this.
Well, I think Professor McGinley gave a good tutorial there on the dynamics of these congressional races. I do think it's kind of gotten back to politics is more local from a congressional race, not as much of a national campaign. I think New York and California are pretty tough battlegrounds for Republicans to pick up seats. And if I had to really make a judgment today, I think the Democrats have a bit of an edge in terms of likelihood of retaking the House. I think it's the opposite on the Senate. I think that'd be the first flip that we've seen, certainly in modern history in our country, of that occurring. And then that goes to the executive branch, the president, who is president, and how he or she can govern depending on the outcome of the congressional election. So I think they're absolutely crucial to our country and to this election. It's a consequential election, not only at the presidential race, but at the congressional level as well.
And Hef, if you can you bring up chart 10? Here we'll be able to see all of the competitive races according to the Cook Political Report, from those that are likely D all the way down to toss-up and then all the way over to the likely R column. Currently in those ratings, you've got about 218 is the magic number for those that don't follow politics or know the Congress pretty well, but that's the number that you want for your majority. Right now, we've got about 26 races that are considered toss-ups and 11 seats that are lean Democratic and 6 that lean Republican. Bill, while all of these clearly are crucial to which party retains control or gets control of the House, are there any of them that you're looking at on election night to get an idea which way you think the election's going to go, at least for determining who's going to be in control of the chamber?
Yeah, I think some of the New York races are the ones that I would look for in terms of early results to see what sort of night it could be for the House Republicans. I think the House Republicans do have some pickup opportunities, but I think some of the Virginia races I would take a look at. But it's really going to come down to the suburbs, I think. If the Republicans can hold on to the suburban, the Collar County seats that they do have, I think that's going to be a big tell. I still think, looking at California 47, I don't mean to keep coming back to that race, but I think it's an interesting race because it's Orange County, which, for somebody as ancient as I am, remembers when Orange County was ruby red. Democrats, there was not one Democrat elected in Orange County, and slowly the county changed and became purple, and now it's it's a mixed Democrat Republican delegation. And the 47th congressional district has parts of Huntington Beach, Newport Beach, Irvine, and some of these other areas that historically had been Republican, but the county had changed so much. So I think it'll be interesting to see if a seat like that can go Republican. Because it may be, kind of an indication for a Republican path forward in the suburbs, which is really where control is going to happen for, the House and all these other races. So I know that's a convoluted answer, but the House of Representatives, 435 elections. They're all unique. The candidates are contests between two individuals. And I think it's going to be a very tight race, just like the presidency. I don't see either party getting control outside of a 5-6. I think that's the ceiling on control, which means if the Democrats were to prevail, which I hope they don't, sorry, Mac, I think that I think whoever, Hakeem Jeffries will have not necessarily all the problems, that Speaker Johnson has had, but he's certainly going to have his share of rebels who are going to try and push, from the Progressive Caucus, their agenda. And their membership is going to be larger than the majority, just like we have with the Republicans. So if we are so divided as a country, we are divided within our own parties as well. And so I think those slim margins make governing a very interesting exercise.
And I think before you start, Mac, I think one of the interesting things, Bill, that you pointed out there is, what it would be like for Hakeem Jeffries to have a slim majority and potentially be the Speaker of the House, and to compare how he runs the House compared to how former Speaker Pelosi ran the House, since she had a really tight grip on her conference there.
That is charitable. She a masterclass and how to govern a caucus.
So
the fact that she had a 3/4 seat majority and was able to keep them unified and together, I would have loved to have been in those caucus meetings just to hear how she did it.
But I didn't mean to interject there, Mac, but I just wanted to make that point real quick.
No, I think Bill made some excellent points. A couple of things I would say. Number one, your longest column there in the health chart, as we can call it, we may try to trademark that. We trademark that name.
I don't know how the political pearl think about that, but for tonight, let's go ahead and say that.
Pretty good to me, but the longest column was clearly the toss-up column, which shows the uncertainty of it. Number two, I think I just have a sense that Democrats still have a edge in the suburbs. Bill mentioned that a couple of times in his analysis, which I think was spot on. I think that does not necessarily bode well for the Republicans maintaining the House. I just think there's some tough seats for them to actually win in those seats. I do think New York will be a harbinger. Obviously, California will come later with the counting of the votes and the time zones, and we can perhaps get to the counting of the votes. That's going to be a major issue after November 5th, I think. That's how I see it. I think Bill got it just right. Receiving of 10 at the most, likely 3 to 5, 6. It's going to be nobody's going to have a big ceiling.
And I think one of the races that I'm interested in is Iowa 1, and not necessarily for what it would say in terms of who may have the majority, but for just a lesson in civic duty and making sure you go vote. Because if someone says that, oh, my vote really isn't going to make a difference, if you look at that seat where Congresswoman Mariette Miller Meeks won in 2020, that race was decided by 6 votes. So for those of you at home, if you don't think your vote matters, it absolutely does. So please go ahead and vote if you're eligible to do so in this election.
Amen. And David, let me say another seat that I think is very interesting, and that's up in Maine, Golden. Maine too? Because President Trump won it in 16 and 20, but Golden has been able to win that seat. So it's a very interesting district to me, not only because of the way that the electoral votes are allocated, but how a Democrat has been able to win that seat when President Trump prevails. So it's a very interesting political dynamic in that seat.
Yeah, I know Congressman Golden reasonably well, like and respect him, former served our country with distinction as a military veteran. That was the Bill Cohen seat, as they like to refer to it.
Well, moving to the next chamber over in the Senate, Hef, if you can bring up chart 8. Here we can see the map of the Senate races this cycle. You've got Democrats defending 23 seats compared to Republicans 9. So Democrats are clearly playing defense in this election. Hef, if you can also bring up chart 9, we'll see the Cook Political Report race ratings for the Senate. Currently, Democrats have 51 seats that include the 4 independents that caucus with them, and Republicans hold 49 in the Senate. I think it's pretty safe right now to make the first election call, and I think we can say that Governor Jim Justice has won West Virginia. So that would make a 50-50 Senate with the tie-breaking vote going to the vice president. You've got the Montana race between, 3-term Democratic John Tester and businessman, and veteran Tim Sheehy. That race was recently moved to the lean Republican column after, 2 months of polling showing Sheehy leading in those races, in those polls. Then you've got in Arizona with Congressman and Sigma Chi, Ruben Gallego, leading his Republican opponent in virtually every poll. Then you look at Democratic Congresswoman Elisa Slotkin in Michigan, Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen in Nevada, Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown in Ohio, Democratic Senator Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, and Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin. All of them follow that same pattern that they've been leading their Republican challengers. But we're getting closer to the election. Polls have started to narrow, especially in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and even Texas, where we see Republican Senator Ted Cruz going up for re-election. With West Virginia flipping and Montana most likely to follow that, it looks like the projected outcome is going to favor Republicans there. Bill, what do you think that we haven't really seen a more competitive cycle this year with these battleground races?
Well, I think some of them have been very competitive. I think Ohio is a prime example. I think, Sherrod Brown's race, it seems to be following the same trajectory as J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance started down pretty bad, and then as the cycle went on, continued to climb in the polls. And the Republican candidate seems to be, following the same trajectory here. I mean, Sherrod Brown raised like $30 million or something in 1 month. I mean, the amount of money was astronomical. So I think Ohio is going to be an interesting race. As somebody who was, in the NRSC in 2006, watching John Tester, he's always been a very tough Democrat for Republicans to run against in Montana. But it sure looks like the Republicans got the right candidate in Sheehy. Seems to be running a good race. They had a good debate performance against them. I mean, this may be the time that Republicans are able to pick up that seat. But just like the House, I mean, there is a possibility that either party could only be a 51-52. Depending upon how this goes. There is a scenario where, one of them, maybe the Republicans could go higher, but this is going to be the most favorable map that the Republicans are going to have for a bit. So, if Republicans need to run up the score, this is the cycle to do it. And so, looking at Nevada, I wish Nevada was more competitive. I think we still got a shot there. Kerry Lake and Gallego out in Arizona. I mean, I think if Trump were to prevail in Arizona by more than 5 points, that could pull Lake across the finish line. But we'll see. I mean, that's going to be a tough race. I mean, it's just going to take more investment over the next 3 weeks. I also think that, there may be a sleeper race out there. I'm old enough to remember when Mark Warner ran against Ed Gillespie. And the Warner-Gillespie race wasn't on anybody's radar screen. And at the end of the election, the difference was a couple hundred votes, right? And, Republicans were like, why didn't we pump some money into that? So, there could be one of these sleeper statewide races, like a Senate race like that just comes out of nowhere, one way or the other, to do it. I think at the end of the day, Senator Cruz will be okay in Texas. I think he's going to spend more money than he needs to. I think he's going to have a tighter race than he ever wants. But I think at the end of the day, he'll prevail. I do think it's more likely than not that the Republicans pick up the Senate, but I'm not going to bet the farm on it. But I do think Republicans are going to pick up the Senate, but it could be, it could be a slim margin, just like the House. Or if, President Trump has a great night, which I hope he does, maybe he pulls a couple of these Senate candidates across the finish line. It's a tough map for Democrats, right? I mean, really I think, Democrats have more seats to defend. With the West Virginia, with Manchin retiring, and just giving that up, I mean, that puts us 50-50 right there. And then it becomes, are we going to trade paint on some of these races, or are they all going to fall one way? So,
Matt, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think Bill surprises can happen both ways. So we might
absolutely. Just ask Mike Castle, but that was a primary election.
Yeah, Mike Governor Castle is a good man. I think the Texas race is closer than Senator Cruz would like. Whether Allred can prevail at the end of the day, we'll see. Rick Scott's had a tough race, but I think he seems to have steadied and be ahead there. Tester's been kind of the outlier that somehow could prevail in Montana. I think, Phil, some of the difference in this race with Republicans in some of those races, and Sheehy is who I'm referring to in this race, I think the Republicans have in some cases fielded much better candidates this race in the Senate. Yeah. And that reflects much more competitive races where 2-4 years ago, I think Republicans were hampered by some of the candidates that were face up against pretty capable political, skilled political figures in other states. I think you're right. I think your bold prediction, David, that West Virginia will go to governor's justice.
I think I'm safe on that one.
will prove to be correct. And that does that he'll bring his dog with him. So that will be 50-50. So I think you get down then to the Montana race. That's 51 votes there if it goes that way. On the other races, I think it's fascinating right now that many Democrats are running 2, 3, 4, 5 points ahead in races that President Trump and Vice President Harris are either dead even or former President Trump has a slight edge. But you see that in Arizona. You see it in Nevada with both Rosen and Gallegos in Arizona and Nevada. You see it with Bob Casey right now in Pennsylvania, even with a very good candidate with Dave McCormick, whom I know and like. But Bob Casey has done a fine job there as senator and is proving to be a strong candidate. And right now, I think the Ohio race is just really very close. But the polls have consistently shown a little bit of an edge for Brown there over Bernie Moreno, whom I also know. So all these races are pretty close. I think the one to watch is Nebraska. I think that's kind of one of the surprises or sleepers. I think those polls are jumping around everywhere with the two candidates there. So that could be a change there as well.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that I would note, just because in our discussion of the presidential election, we were focusing on the blue wall, is the late developments in Michigan and Wisconsin.
I should have mentioned Michigan.
Yeah, with Slotkin, coming out and saying, "Hey, wait a minute, Harris is in trouble up here," almost sending up the signal flare, like, "You need to come in here and help me."
Yeah.
I think Mike Rogers is a strong candidate and a good man, and hope he wins. And Baldwin in Wisconsin, that is tied. I think I got that right. That is, that race, seems to be tied right now. When you look at that, and, that is also reflective of where the presidential race seems to be as well. So some of these states we may see break one way or another, Republican or Democrat, but the blue wall seems to be a battleground, not only for the presidency, but for the Senate as well.
And I think one of the interesting things, too, to see what happens once we get through the election is historically, at least in the last several cycles, the toss-up Senate races tend to group together and move in the same direction. So you've got a majority moving one way or the next. And so it'll be interesting to see if that happens in this one, whether they go together to the Democratic column or to the Republican column. But it's certainly starting to close a little bit closer in those races that you just mentioned.
So, Bill, I just want to interject here for a moment. You've been calling yourself old enough to remember and ancient, and so Mac and I are sitting here wondering, what does that make us? Just saying.
Very knowledgeable and wise.
Oh, what a diplomatic skilled answer! What a diplomatic response, and appreciate it.
So, moving away from the races at the moment, historically, and we really haven't talked about the vice presidential nominees yet, but let's do that for a minute or so, that those individuals have had, relatively little effect on how the elector decides to make their selection for president. That being said, what value, if any, do you believe that, Senator Vance or Governor Walz have brought to their respective campaigns? And let's put a little twist on this. Mac, I'm going to ask you, what would you say about J.D. Vance?
Well, you did flip the script there a little bit, and that's just fine. I'll be anxious to hear what Bill's got to say about Governor Walz. No, I think on the choice of J.D. Vance as running mate, I think former President Trump had 3 or 4 choices there that he carefully considered, including Senator Scott and Rubio, among others. He chose J.D. Vance. I think it brought some contemporary youthfulness to the ticket, which was needed. I think he had in mind the battleground states. He felt Senator Vance would be effective in those battleground states that we've been talking about, and that his life story would resonate with some of these voters that former President Trump feels like he has a connectivity with, and that would reinforce that. I think that was kind of the reasoning on it. I think Senator Vance got off to a pretty good start and then ran into some other issues. I think his debate with Governor Walz was pretty telling, where he really changed his persona and really, I think, presented himself in a different manner. And I think that debate between the two vice presidential candidates got pretty high marks from the American people in how it was conducted. So I think right now we're in the situation where I think people do realize that the vice presidential choice does kind of tell the story in some way, or tell a story. And I think with the assassination attempt and, of course, President Trump's age and so forth, it's pretty clear this is a pretty important decision. So all those things, that's, I think, kind of my reflections on Senator Vance.
Yeah, I think with respect to Senator Walz, you know, and I think Mack will agree with me.
The Petroleum Bill, Governor Walz.
Say Governor Walz, excuse me. I think, you know, given what's going on in the world, I think a lot of people looked at these decisions as really the first major test for both candidates, right? You know, President Trump wasn't going to pick VP Mike Pence from the first administration. And so making this selection, I think, told a lot about President Trump and how comfortable he was with, you know, somebody who's a very strong personality like J.D. Vance, incredibly intelligent, well-spoken. And I think that Governor Walz, the selection of Governor Walz by the vice president, I think it's borrowed one of Mack's phrases, tells a similar story. You know, I think that there were a number of contenders that I thought for VP that she was ultimately going to go with. And I think the most obvious one was Governor Shapiro out of Pennsylvania. I think a lot of people on the Republican side thought that he was going to be formidable and somebody who was really going to try and change the dynamics of the race. And we were all very surprised when she passed him over and went with Governor Walz from a state like Minnesota, since Pennsylvania seems to be the fulcrum of everything in American politics right now. Having the incumbent governor there with all the advantages that brings, I think would have been an interesting choice. I think with respect to Governor Walz, you know, I think he had a bit of a honeymoon period as he was being introduced to the American people. And I think he's had a lot of stumbles lately, whether it was the time in China that was brought up during the debate. You know, there's been a lot of questions from fellow veterans on his rank. We all honor his service, but on the rank that he has claimed has been questioned. I think that there are a lot of questions about, you know, the statements that he made during the debate, like, you know, I'm friends with school shooters. You know, a lot of people would try to chalk that up to misstatements, and I think that we all know that to err is human. However, given what's happening internationally, I think the American people are looking for comfort in who they're going to pick. And I think, you know, the question of the selection of Governor Walz, I think is really something, I'm just not sure it really advanced the ball for the vice president at all. I think it did in the short term, but I think as people have gotten to know the governor, I don't think it's helped her at all. And I think it's contributed basically to the honeymoon being over and the sugar high going away. So that's what I have to say about that.
Well, I know we're a little bit over our time, and we're coming to the last few questions before we take some from our participants who are joining us tonight at home. In this cycle, we've seen really some movement, especially when we had President Biden on the ballot. And there's been, you know, definite movement after that fact with traditional voting blocks, whether that be with seniors, whether that be with Black and Hispanic voters, particularly males in this election, white women and young voters. You know, Mack, which blocks have you seen shift the most since 2020? And are there any that you're looking at that you think are going to be the most influential in this election?
I think on balance, Vice President Harris has been able to consolidate the Democratic base, not totally, but largely. So I think she's got a pretty good foundation to build from. I think former President Trump is making a real effort to really chip away at the Hispanic and the African-American vote, and has made some progress there. I do think the younger vote, Vice President Harris has made some real gains there. And it's always a question, how many will turn out and vote? I think there's a much better likelihood that turnout will be stronger in this election of younger voters than in past elections. So that's kind of the assessment I see. And then you've got what I'm going to say, Bill, is the traditional Republican or Nikki Haley voter, the moderate Republican, however you want to describe the voters in the primary that ran and lost to former President Trump. There's also that base of voters And I think Vice President Harris is making an effort for those voters, and she will get some of them. So that's kind of the pluses and the minuses, I think, that are being weighed currently as I see it from Vice President Harris's side.
And what about you, Bill? Any demographics you're looking at or voting blocks that you think are to be really influential this cycle?
I think union members. You look at the Teamster failure to endorse a presidential candidate at the same time releasing the poll of their members that showed it was like 60% for President Trump and 30-something% for Vice President Harris. It wasn't flipped when it was Joe Biden, but Joe Biden was the winner of the union vote for the endorsement of the Teamsters. And we've seen a number of other unions and kind of have the same thing when compared, when President Trump's compared to Vice President Harris. I think, we talked about this. Jim asked, about, whether Vice President Harris's, status as a woman is a factor in this race. And I kind of go back to where we started, which is, if wrong track is at 71%, people are itching for change, right? I think, President Trump and J.D. Vance in the campaign are working to make that change acceptable to the low propensity and medium propensity voters. And I think the union members, the rank and file union members, are going to be a key part of that. We started to see the trend with Hispanics, but also African-American males begin to move Republican in 2020. Remember, former President Trump, received significant more votes from those blocks than I think had been won by previous Republicans. I think George W. Bush may have gotten similar, close to on the Hispanic side, block of votes. But I think making inroads with those historic Democrat constituencies, I think, is something to watch as well. There's so much to talk about in 2024 because it feels like every week we've lived a decade. As somebody with two kids in college, watching the encampments on college campuses, including my alma mater, where Jewish students were being prevented from going to class, where they were yelling anti-Semitic slurs at them, right? I never thought I would see in the United States in 2024, but here we are. I look at, some of the crime that has happened in the nation's capital, and frankly, that friends around the country have had to experience in their neighborhoods and around their businesses. We've never had that before. I've never seen district attorneys who say, you know what, you can steal up to $950 and we're not going to prosecute you, and basically give license to flash mobs to go into retail stores that are driving them out of cities. I've never seen some of this stuff before. And I'm going to share a personal note that has really animated me in this election. One of my friends was murdered in Washington, D.C. earlier this year in a carjacking. And all he did wrong was show up to pick his wife up from work. And a guy jumped in his car, demanded his wallet, and shot him in the head. And so when these types of issues become that personal for me, when they can become that personal for my family, when they become that personal for voters across the country, and nobody wants to talk about it, it's a consequential election. And I think you're going to see a lot of people motivated that historically have sat out elections because they're tired of what's happening. And they know that this has got to change. Gascon, the DA out in LA, from what I can read, is down by 30 points. This is the guy who won't prosecute violent criminals. And I think it was the 2021 election when Youngkin won. Remember what happened up in New Jersey, what happened in New York City. Some of the boroughs were electing conservative DAs. People are rebelling against this. And I know that's probably a little bit more partisan than we wanted to get, but I think people need to understand, if I'm feeling this, I know others are as well. And I've seen a lot of people change over these last 3.5 years coming out of the pandemic, and a lot of the mistakes that were made there, and seeing what's been happening. And there's a better way forward for this country. America is better than this. And everybody should benefit from what we do in this country. We should support each other, and we should start lifting everybody as opposed to pushing some people down or causing some of this stuff to happen. So I apologize for getting personal on this, but it's a real motivator for me this election cycle. I've never had anything happen like that. I've worried about it with friends in law enforcement or the military, but I got to tell you, this has got to change.
Well, Bill, no need to apologize. We're all brothers here, and I know that's not necessarily an easy thing to bring up and talk about, but thank you for providing that perspective. I think all of us on the call tonight appreciate that and your candidacy with that.
Bill, sorry to hear about that personal story, truly. I do have one other question on this topic. With respect to the African-American males, to what do you attribute the shift that you've discussed?
Because he's a fighter. I think the Butler assassination attempt, the people, I didn't serve in the military, and it's something I've always regretted. I think the men and women who put on the uniform and actually courageously go out and defend our freedom deserve the most this country has to offer. But when you talk to them who have actually served in combat, to see the reaction of somebody who has just been shot in the ear, and if his head would have been turned 1 inch different way, we would have had a very different story that day. To actually get up and say, fight, 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 and show the fight that he did, I think changed a lot of hearts and minds. I was in Milwaukee when that happened. We were walking back to the Campaign Hotel when all of a sudden all of our phones started blowing up about the assassination attempt. It's not a good feeling to hear that, somebody who, and friends that, that you're working with and for on some of this stuff go through that. I think that there's a lot of shared experiences there. And I think that what's happening is that a lot of people, especially Hispanics and African Americans and everybody else, is looking at their children and want a better future. But I also think it's the economic opportunity. And I just don't think people really feel like that's there right now. And so I think, for Hispanics and African Americans and Asian Americans, and frankly, for all Americans, I think we're all in this together. We're one country. We may have differences, but we need to come together, because if we don't, we're going to fall apart. And there's a lot of people who want to bring us down abroad, from, the CCP to some of these other folks. And I think that African Americans who served with valor, with bravery in the military and everything else, their shared experiences are all of our shared experiences. And I think that what they go through, we all go through. And I think, part of this is maybe we're seeing the breakdown of how we look at people as classes of people. And maybe what we need to do is what the founders originally intended, which is we're all individuals with our own rights. We're not just groups of people that can be categorized. And I think that's something that I think a lot of people look at. I think I answered your question. I know I kind of went off on a little bit, but Jim, anyways, I just think it's the realities of what we have right now, and people want a better way.
Thanks for that input.
Well, one final question from me before we take some questions from our audience and turn it back over to Jim. Bill, if Trump wins this election, what's the single most important capability you believe he will bring back to the White House?
I think it's a desire to reform the federal government. I think, it was starting in the first administration. I think it's really trying to get the federal government responsive to the American people. Everybody talks about the deep state and everything like that. It's the permanent, bureaucracy that we've had that is really swollen. And I think that's number one. Number two is the economy. And I think the economy actually is number one, is trying to cut the government spending, getting inflation under control, getting interest rates down, providing making sure that businesses have access to capital so that we can create the jobs. If you remember, during the first administration, one of the things that we did that a lot of people didn't want to talk about was the apprentice program, where private businesses, we encouraged them to couple with the junior colleges and others to teach trades, right? Not every kid should go get an art history degree, but sometimes the trades, the blue collar royalty, as I always called, because my dad was a landscaper, a Sigma Chi and a landscaper. I was proud to dig holes with them, right? And, the electricians, the carpenters, the plumbers, all of these people who have great skills, and teaching them to get there, plus the jobs of tomorrow, right? I mean, we have so many jobs that go unfilled that because they can't find the workers with the skill sets. So I think, the economy, transforming the federal government, getting the interest rates down, but also getting us to the workforce of tomorrow to the jobs that are available and the jobs that, frankly, are going to be there for the long haul.
And Mac, what do you think is going to be Vice President Harris's single most important capability if she's able to win and go to the White House?
I would cite two points, one of which will be consistent with what Bill says. The first point, I think, from an international standpoint, it is crucial that we keep our international relationships intact and build those stronger. We've got a changing world with the rise of China, with the Ukraine war and Russia, the kind of the coalition of China and Russia, Iran and North Korea, which Bill pointed out. I think Vice President Harris is well suited to do that. Number two, I would go to the point, and I'm a between the 40s guy, a strong believer in bipartisanship and the points made about unity and working together. I could not agree. That's what I've worked all my life on in politics. I would also underscore on the size of government, is what we haven't talked about tonight is the federal deficit and debt. And yes. I'm very proud that during the Clinton-Gore administration, we cut the debt in half the first term and balanced the budget in the second term and had a rising tide lifting all boats. But you have to be able to govern to do that. And I think that is a question mark about former President Trump and how much unity he can build, regardless of some of the policies, apprenticeships. Bill could not agree more on that and other things. So I think what's going to be, I would say the 2 points would be international coalitions and the ability to govern. And we talked about that Senate race, and I meant to make the point then. You've got 3 Republican senators in that mix, assuming that Jim Justice is indeed elected, and we see that the Senate perhaps play out as we discussed, with Collins and Murkowski and John Curtis from Arizona, from Utah. And I think Senator Curtis, Bill, if I have it correct, did not endorse President Trump and still won the Senate election in Utah, which is that's quite telling. So I think that gives you the basis for a potential governing coalition, but it will take leadership to do that. Those would be the 2 things I would cite.
Well, I know we're a little bit past our time, and we've had some questions sent in to us and some comments posted on the site. Hef, if you're able, let's take Charlie's question and pose that to both Mac and Bill. So Charlie's asking, how was the significant migration of population out of the blue states to red really affecting election results?
I'll go first.
Yeah,
I think it's TBD, right? Like, yeah. I actually know people who left the Bay Area to move to Austin, Texas. I think that's having an impact down in Texas. But I also think that Texas is still as red as can be. President Trump's going to do fine. I think Ted Cruz is going to win. I think Florida is another state that has benefited from a lot of migration, especially during the pandemic. You saw a lot of Wall Street firms moving down to Miami. Miami became a capital of crypto technology, and a lot of that stuff, coming out of California. Just look at the census, the allocation, the apportionment of the seats. I mean, New York and California were 2 of the big losers because of the population shifts, and red states were actually gaining congressional seats because of the migration that happened as a result of the pandemic and some of the other issues that we've talked about earlier. So how is it actually going to affect the election results? It's interesting because some of the red states have actually picked up electoral votes. And that could be a material issue, or depending upon how close this election actually is. So I think, we apportion our House seats according to population. And I really think that the migration of Americans to a lot of these different states, I think, is going to have a long-term impact on politics. I think it's going to take a little bit more time for us to determine what that change is going to be.
Mac, any thoughts?
Given that we're running over time here, I'll be very brief. I concur. I think it is TBD. I think it cuts both ways at the moment. We'll have to see how this plays out. I think in this election we discussed it by section and geography.
Well, I want to thank both of you all before I turn things back over to Jim. It's been a pleasure talking with both of you tonight. You're two stellar Sigma Chi's that we've got in the fraternity, and I couldn't be happier to be here talking with both of you all. Thank you for what you do, have done professionally, what you've been able to talk about tonight. And with that, turn things back over to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you, David. And David, great job as always, serving as moderator. Really appreciate that. And I think you really brought the most out of the Sig Talk from our guests. And Bill and Mac, all I can say is you exceeded expectations. CNN and Fox News, eat your heart out. These guys are better. So we are going to have to kind of cut it a little bit short. I wanted to ask a couple of personal questions, but we'll save that for another time. And I know we'll have you guys back for the midterms in 2026. Just a couple of things that on behalf of the New York Alumni Chapter and the Washington Alumni Chapter, and I'm sure that Bill and Mac would concur with this, we want to urge you to do two things. Certainly get out and vote on November 5th. Please do. And if you prefer early voting and your state offers that option, then by all means do that. And then when you go out and vote, if you're going to the polls, please show the utmost respect and appreciation for the poll workers there who are volunteers and who really make our elections free and fair. Show them your appreciation and thank them. So again, on behalf of the New York and the Washington, D.C. Chapters, and Bill McGinley and Mack McLarty and David Ashenoff, thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.